Welcome to the session on research ethics. My name is Michelle Howarth, and in this session we will explore the key principles of research ethics that will enable you to consider the ethical implications of conducting your research. The following lecture will cover the ethical principles in relation to the conduct of research, the professional regulatory guidance and the frameworks on the conduct of ethical research, and the principles of patient, participant or subject autonomy. We must think about why we need research ethics. What could possibly go wrong? To understand this, we must first consider the key ethical principles and the moral codes that have influenced these. To first consider ethics, you need to explore what this means for you as an individual and as a researcher. This may involve understanding societal morals and the influence this has on the way in which we respond to and treat others around us. It is argued that morality is a social enterprise that is determined by complexities associated with cultural norms as determined by society. The way in which our morals are shaped are invariably influenced by our environment and societal structures. That said, our self as an individual and the subjectivity of being human can create challenges that may conflict with societal norms. Hence, morality becomes inherently problematic. Ethics help us to manage the concept of morality by providing frameworks which help us determine what is right and what ought to be done. Hence, ethical considerations provide a framework for decision-making and moral thinking. Essentially, they guide decisions, many of which are already underpinned by professional obligations. There are a number of key ethical principles that the researcher needs to consider prior to conducting their research project. These are as follows: autonomy, which is respect for self-determination and is closely linked to things like participant information and consent. Beneficence, is your project doing good? Of what benefit is it for the participants? Non-maleficence, what are the harms, potential risks? Above all, we do no harm. Justice, integrity, how trustworthy is our research, and how truthful are we going to report the research. All of these key principles will be discussed over the next few slides. Autonomy. Autonomy is a concept in moral and bioethical philosophy. It sits at the heart of the individual's ability to self-determination. An individual's autonomy is integral to the ability to make an informed decision, and that this decision is made freely and without coercion from another party. It is argued by many that autonomy is central to the decision-making processes of an individual within the research context and underpins the principles of informed consent. Autonomy hence relates to an individual's right to make a decision based on accurate information that is provided in a non-coercive manner. Autonomy enables a meaningful choice to be made by the individual. Hence, it's argued that autonomous individuals act intentionally, with appropriate information and in the absence of coercion. Researchers therefore have an obligation to ensure that a person is fully supported to make an autonomous decision about their participation and/or role in the research. This includes respecting the individual's rights, confidentiality and privacy. The ability to make autonomous decisions should not be undermined, and individuals should be given time, at least 24 hours, to make an informed choice about whether or not they want to participate in the research. Within the context of research, this means that the researcher should create the conditions needed for an individual to make an autonomous decision, which includes the appropriate information in layman's terms, the time to consider the information, the right to ask questions about the research, the benefits and the risks, and the right to withdraw. Violations to autonomy have been well recorded in history, and there are a number of examples of research that have been conducted unethically. One of the most famous was the Tuskegee trials, which took place in the United States. In 1932, the standard treatments for syphilis were toxic, and some had dangerous side effects. There are some who questioned whether patients with syphilis were better off if left untreated. To explore the natural disease progression and understand each stage of the disease, a study called the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male also known as the Tuskegee Syphilis Study Public Health Service Syphilis Study, or the Tuskegee Experiment, was a clinical study conducted between 1932 and 1972 in Tuskegee, Alabama, by the U.S. Public Health Service. The sample population included 399 poor African Americans, some of whom were illiterate. They were recruited into the syphilis study because they had a diagnosis of syphilis, and the researchers wanted to explore the natural progression of the disease if left untreated. The study was longitudinal and conducted over a 40-year period, during which the participants did not receive treatment for their syphilis. However, in 1947, penicillin had a proven efficacy for the treatment of syphilis, but the treatment and any information about it was withheld from the participants, even though it was known that penicillin was an effective treatment for syphilis at that time. The study continued until 1972, when it was finally leaked to the press and the study was terminated. During the trial, there had been a number of men who had died from the disease, and their wives had contracted syphilis, which meant that many of their children were born with congenital syphilis. This 40-year study was controversial for a number of reasons, but mainly it violated the key principle of autonomy and led to major changes within U.S. law to regulate research and ensure the protection of people within clinical studies. The Tuskegee trials led to the Belmont Report in 1979 and the establishment of the Office of Human Research Protections. Some of the most shocking and inhumane experiments took place in Nazi concentration camps during the Second World War. Many of the experiments included a number of prisoners, mainly Jewish people, who were coerced into trials without consent, without the right to withdraw, or consideration of their basic human rights. Many experiments resulted in the death or mutilation and were considered to be torture. The Nazi experimentation led to the development of the Nuremberg Code of Medical Ethics. In the months following the trials of the Nazi researchers, Yale University psychologist called Stanley Milgram became interested in whether there was a mutual sense of morality amongst those involved in the experiments, and developed a psychological study to explore whether the perpetrators had mutual intent. Milgram suggested that the participants were simply following orders, even though their actions, in this case being asked to show up for the participants, conflicted with their morals. The experiment measured the willingness of participants to obey authority figures' instructions that conflicted with their own morality. And it's argued that these experiments were harmful because they reduced the trust that people have in others, and as a result, came under greater scrutiny from institutional review boards. In all cases that have been reported, the main ethical principles of autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, trust, and veracity have been compromised. The potential costs of the research must be carefully weighed up. However, the potential costs of research are varied and needed to be considered in relation to the associated risks and benefits. Costs can include physical harm to participants in the research, such as the risks of injury or pain. Where there is a potential to cause physical harm, even if this is minor, such as a needle stick or other minor trauma, the researcher must ensure that all physical risks are controlled and mitigated. Participants must be made aware of the potential physical harm before agreeing to consent. Other risks include unanticipated side effects. Whilst researchers can advise that a project or trial will cause no harm, they also need to ensure that participants are aware that no research is without risk, and whilst every effort is used to mitigate this, there are no absolute guarantees of no side effects. The potential for discomfort and even fatigue or boredom must be considered, and in particular the potential for emotional distress. This may be inadvertently caused through the use of inclusion of a sensitive question or exploring an emotive subject area. Wherever possible, the researcher should carefully consider the likelihood of emotional distress and ensure that a strategy is in place to first reduce the risk and provide support for any person who may become distressed. This could be the contact details for a support service, or the termination of an interview, or the direct access to support. Often research results in the loss of privacy for those who willingly volunteer to participate in research. This may particularly be pertinent in qualitative research, which may encourage participants to discuss emotive or sensitive issues, or ask someone to describe personal details or a life event. When an individual enters into a research study, it must be made clear that their confidentiality will be maintained, and that they may be revealing private details about their lives. Reassurances must be provided that all personal details will remain confidential. Finally, the often hidden costs associated with participating in research includes the loss of time for the participants. Even the completion of a postal survey carries an expectation that the respondents will freely give up their time to reply to the survey. In other types of research, where face-to-face contact is needed, the time spent travelling to the research location and spending time with the data collection phase results in a loss for participants. The researcher needs to ensure that the time is used constructively and any remuneration required is adhered to. The benefits of research. Although as a researcher you cannot promise an individual that your study will benefit them directly, you should outline what the key benefits could be for the population or subject area in general. Some potential benefits may be discussed, such as an individual's potential to access a new intervention, although the risks which will be discussed in this session must be weighed and presented alongside the benefits. Participating in research may also provide an opportunity to discuss the situation or healthcare intervention with an objective researcher. Equally, participating in research may increase the knowledge base of a particular disease, intervention or therapy. For some, research has shown that taking part in research projects has improved self-esteem, as they feel they are helping others. Although the participation in research has led to altruistic satisfaction, it is important to discuss the benefits and acknowledge that the benefits of your research shouldn't be overstated. Hence, the researcher needs to be truthful and accurate to allow the individual to make an informed choice, hence applying to the principles of veracity and trustworthiness. Equally, the potential risks of the participant must be fully explained. As discussed previously, the types of risks associated with human research range widely. Human research can also include recruiting people from a wide-ranging target population, some of which may be considered vulnerable. In all examples, the population harms and risks of the research need to be carefully considered. There are a number of projects that, whilst would be in the public interest, would be too risky and therefore unethical to conduct. For example, if you wanted to look at the risk of injury of using cot rails to prevent people from getting out of bed, or you wanted to find out whether or not certain types of bedding are a causal factor for sudden infant death syndrome, you'd be able to do this because the risks would be too high and the harms it would pose to the population under study. In these cases, other types of evidence from retrospective audits should be considered. To ensure that researchers have considered the risks, most ethics committees will require in their application form a risk analysis in which the project team or researcher will need to complete and understand what the key risks are before they submit. So you need to consider whether the risks of undertaking your research are mitigated and whether or not there is a potential for unanticipated harm, as discussed in the last slide. As discussed in previous slides, there are a number of ethical principles that need to be considered. Hence, there are a number of complex decisions that need to be made prior to undertaking research. The ethical implications for any project need to be discussed and, where possible, mitigated. To prevent poor research practice and unethical research, a number of professional regulatory bodies have developed and published ethics frameworks to guide and support the researcher. Whilst these frameworks vary in terms of the language and professional context, the key principles outlined at the start of this lecture are clearly visible in each of the frameworks. You will need to discuss the appropriate frameworks with your supervisor and decide which one is most appropriate for your work or study. All the frameworks encourage you to consider beneficence and non-maleficence or risks. the veracity, justice and trustworthiness of your project through the information you provide to the ethics panels, the target population and wider audience, the rights of the individuals involved in every aspect of the research, and the ability of the participants to make an informed and autonomous decision to take part in the research. The next slides detail the key principles from some of the professional frameworks, but you need to refer to the online workbook to support your learning and access the frameworks that are relevant for your study. Some of the key ethical frameworks will now be discussed. These will include the ESRC, the Economic and Social Research Council, the BPS, or British Psychological Society, and the WHO, World Health Organization. You should identify the ethical frameworks that meets your professional regulatory body requirements and discuss this with your supervisor. The first framework to be discussed is the ESRC. This is a fairly generic framework that many professionals use. It has 6 key principles. Firstly, that research should be designed, reviewed and undertaken to ensure integrity and quality. Secondly, that research staff and subjects must be informed fully about the purpose, methods and intended possible uses of the research, what their participant in research entails and what risks, if any, are involved. Third, that the confidentiality of information supplied by the research subjects and the anonymity of responses must be respected. 4. That research participants must participate in a voluntary way, free from any coercion. 5. That harm to research participants must be avoided. And finally, that the independence of the research must be clear and any conflicts of interest or partiality must be made explicit. The World Health Organization ethical principles are based on the Declaration of Helsinki following the Nuremberg trials. The principles relate mainly to medical research and suggest that it's the duty of the physician who participates in medical research to protect the life, health, dignity, right to self-determination, privacy of personal information, and the research subjects. Within this, 4 of the key principles are inherent, and this includes risk, information provision, the rights of the individual, and to ensure that the science base is robust. Another set of ethical principles and guidance has been developed by the British Psychological Society. Their Code of Conduct, Ethical Principles and Guidelines have a number of key principles. They mainly relate to psychologists, but the principles are reflected in other professional regulatory frameworks as well. In particular, the BPS Code of Conduct suggests that psychologists shall conduct themselves in a manner that does not bring disrepute, that research should be carried out with the highest standards of integrity, and that all involved in research are safeguarded. Equally, they argue that the person undertaking the research should be competent, that informed consent should be obtained, that confidentiality should be maintained, that the rights of the person to withdraw should be upheld, and that they should be protected from harm. Interestingly, there are 2 principles within the BPS Code of Conduct that aren't reflected in other codes of conduct, and that relates to deception and debrief. This means that if you intend to deceive somebody for the purpose of the research, then a full rationale should be provided, and that there should be an opportunity at the end of every research project for a debrief, so that the person who's participated in research can understand if there was any deception, why that was, and to ensure that this hasn't caused any harm or upset. As with all the ethical guidelines, the key principles are reflected throughout, so they may sound similar. In returning to the original discussion we had at the start of this lecture, the key principles of autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, fidelity, and veracity are easily seen within all of the frameworks and need to be adhered to whichever project you decide to do. Importantly, perhaps the most significant aspect of the key principles is that of autonomy and the rights of the individual involved. Participant information and informed consent are key principles that must be upheld, and they'll be discussed next. Informed consent is central to the principle of autonomy and should be adhered to in all research projects. Exceptions may involve some covert research that is fully justified and that which could be undermined if participants were aware they were being involved in research. For example, this could include an observational study of a ward or unit where it is believed that high levels of nosocomial infections are as a result of poor hand-washing techniques. In this example, covert observational research would be undertaken to enable researchers to observe staff hand-washing procedures. If staff were aware that they were being observed, their behaviour and normal practices may change. This is sometimes referred to as the Hawthorne effect. In covert observational studies, where the Hawthorne effect is predicted, informed consent may be obtained after the observation has taken place. However, any covert research needs careful consideration by the researcher and full ethical approval is needed. Arguably, informed consent is key to the ethical process within research. For consent to be informed, the researcher has to assure a number of things. For example, the informed consent sheet needs to be signed. In particular, the individual is signing to say that they are competent to make an informed decision. The researcher has to make sure that a thorough disclosure of the research is provided through written format, for example a participant information sheet, and/or verbally if required. The researcher needs to be assured that the participant comprehends what's being asked of them, and this can be checked through asking the participant to explain what they understand about the research. The participant has to act voluntarily. This means without coercive means. There may be some challenges associated with this, particularly if the participant is familiar with the researcher, either through friendship, family, or through health or social care provision. In these cases, it is not advisable for family or friends to participate in your research. Equally, if you are the care provider or a research participant, your role and the power dynamic, i.e. the influence you may have in coercing the individual, must be carefully considered and mitigated. In some cases, third-party recruitment strategies are used to ensure that participants don't feel obliged to take part in a study because a carer has asked them to. Autonomous choice can be affected by tone of voice, the framing of information in such a way that it's misleading or more attractive, or perceptions of reward that are greater or enhanced than reality. Here, the ethical principle of veracity underpins the way in which information is provided to the participant to make an informed choice. As part of the ethical process, the rights for individuals to make informed decisions to participate in research are paramount. This ensures that the individual's autonomy is respected and is a fundamental element of making informed decisions. This means that an individual should have access to information about the research at a minimum of 24 hours before they decide to participate. There may be some exceptional circumstances to this as a result of some sampling strategies that may require access and consent to participate in an event that is very much context-bound. In these cases, the right to withdraw after the project data has been obtained must be made explicit. Equally, any individual consenting to participate in research should be provided with an opportunity to withdraw from the study at any point without prejudice. This should be made explicit in any participant information provided. Generally, participants must be aware of what they are consenting to, what is involved, and the associated risks and benefits. Typically, participant information sheets should include information about the following: the aims of the study, why it's being conducted, why they have been selected, what specifically will happen to them, what they will need to do to participate. For example, do you want them to complete a survey or attend an interview, or do you want them to take part in a trial that involves an intervention? All procedures involved with intervention studies and other types of study must be explained to the participant. Information must also be provided about the risks involved and the potential benefits and what they can expect. Details about how their data will be kept confidential should be included, along with information about where it will be stored, who will have access to it, how their data will be protected. The researcher must also inform participants what will happen into the data both during and after the completion of the study. For example, where will it be published or presented? Finally, the contact details of the researcher and/or team need to be provided so that participants may contact you for any additional information. Equally, details of support services or complaints procedures need to be included at the end of the participant information sheet. All of these details need to be presented in layman's terms, so this must be age appropriate in a language that can be understood by the participant and in a format that is accessible. You will need to see your own college website for an example of participant information sheets or your local research ethics committees for further details. As part of the participant information sheet, data protection of the individual's details needs to be clearly outlined. This also forms part of the Data Protection Act, which is used in the UK. This indicates that the rights of the research participants to confidentiality and privacy are central to the key principle of autonomy. Research participants should be respected for their rights to remain anonymous within the research study, and their potential details should be kept confidential. A key component of the ethical process therefore involves the way in which participant data is protected. In the UK, researchers often use the Data Protection Act as a framework to guide their data protection management. The Data Protection Act emphasises that researchers are responsible for storing raw data in a secure place with security clearly being outlined. Raw data is that which has been obtained either through interview recordings, observation, field notes, and/or experimentation or interventional studies. In all cases, the researcher must identify how they will store the raw data, who will have access to this, where it will be stored, and the security arrangements. In addition, participants may be reassured that their raw data will be coded and anonymised before analysis starts, and that the raw data will only be used for research purposes. This may include the use of data for secondary analysis or the use of data in publications. Participants must be informed of where the research findings will be published and/or presented, and reassured that their details will remain confidential. Whilst researchers need to consider the risks of research participants being involved in research and ensuring that they don't come to any harm, there is also other risks for the researcher to consider. For example, if you are planning to go into somebody's home or an unfamiliar building to undertake data collection, you must first explore the risks of lone working. The University of Salford's lone worker policy advises that lone working must be risk assessed and the following controls considered. Wherever there is a significant risk that work tasks might result in the injury to a university researcher, you need to adopt a two-person working rule. The general interpretation of this rule is that there are two people present in the area where the task or research is undertaken, and the sole purpose of this rule is to provide immediate assistance to summon help in case of accident or injury. For those people who are going off-site to maybe do an interview or a survey as part of their research, you need to make sure that somebody knows where you are and that you are easily contacted. You can either set up a research buddy or a supervisor, and you should set clear criteria of when you should expect to contact them. Equally, if they can't contact you or you do not contact them after an event, then there should be measures in place to take this forward and escalate it as a concern. In all cases, the risks of the researcher must be very carefully considered. Through this lecture, we have discussed the ethical principles in relation to the conduct of research. There are some examples, however, where the researcher has had their ethics form rejected for a number of reasons. The most common ones relate to the fact that the informed consent procedures haven't been well thought through, or they've not provided enough time for participants to make a decision. In other examples, they may have asked participants to consent for a study before they've actually had time to read the information, or the researchers haven't been available for questions. In other examples, they might have exaggerated the benefits or not really highlighted the risks. So where participant information is lacking, misleading or wrong, it directly influences the principle of autonomy. I hope this lecture has helped you to consider some of the key ethical principles associated with research. You now need to discuss in detail with your supervisor what you feel the principles are in relation to your project. Other areas of inquiry might be your local research and development manager, the local ethics chair, your supervisor, or another member of the research team. I'd like to wish you good luck with your project. Thank you.